Have you ever seen something so wild, so out of place? It made you question what was real. The Colorado wind that morning carried more than dust and pine. It carried a whisper, the kind you don't hear with your ears, but feel in your chest. Out by his porch, Thaddeus Carmichael, a weathered rancher who hadn't spoken to a soul in weeks, saw something that stopped his heart. Not a coyote, not a wolf, not even a bear, but a blood trail leading straight to his water well. And at the end of it, a girl. Not just any girl. A girl crouched like an animal. Eyes sharp, hands clawed, bleeding but not begging. And in that instant, Thaddeus knew this wasn't just another morning on the ranch. This was the moment everything would change. If you believe in stories that test the limits of trust, survival, and second chances, stick around. Because what happened on that ranch would echo through the valley for generations to come. Like this video, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if a wild stranger showed up at your door? The dawn broke soft and golden over the Carmichael ranch, the way it always did in early autumn. The frost still clung to the grass, and the only sound was the distant cry of hawks echoing off the canyons. Thaddeus Carmichael stepped out onto his porch with a tin cup of black coffee, expecting nothing but another quiet morning. But something was wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't shout, it whispers. There in the dirt just beyond his front steps was blood. Not a puddle, not a splatter. A trail deliberate, steady, and still wet. It curved toward his water well, the only clean source for miles. Now Thaddeus had spent 2 years in near total solitude after his wife Margaret passed. The wilderness had become a kind of quiet companion. He could read the land the way a man reads scripture, and he knew this wasn't animal blood. Too thick, too paced. This wasn't the stumble of a dying deer or the reckless rush of a wounded cougar. No, this was something different, something human. He followed it slowly, rifle cradled, but not raised the way a man walks when he's not sure if he's about to meet a ghost or a god. The trail past the barn curved around the rusting chicken coop and led him to the smokehouse, a place he hadn't used since Margaret died. And that's where he saw her. A girl. Or maybe a shadow shaped like one. Half crouched, half ready to leap. Covered in mud blood and torn hides. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, he wasn't alone anymore. What makes this moment so powerful isn't just the mystery. It's the collision when wilderness meets the porch, when something raw and untamed enters a space built for comfort and control. Thaddeus wasn't just looking at a stranger. He was looking at a reflection of grief, of isolation, of something barely holding itself together. And that blood trail wasn't just hers, it was his too, symbolically. Every lonely morning since Margaret passed had been its own kind of bleeding. It's like when someone knocks on your door unexpectedly. Maybe a child from next door, maybe an old friend, maybe a stranger, and you have a choice. Ignore it, or open the door and let something new begin. That blood trail, that's life knocking, messy, painful, uninvited. But just maybe it's exactly what you've been needing. Sometimes the things that scare us the most are the same things that remind us we're still alive. And often the first step toward healing doesn't come with answers. It comes with a question we're too afraid to ask. What if I said yes? As Thaddeus slowly lowered his rifle, the girl bared her teeth like a cornered wolf. She didn't ask for help. She didn't cry. She growled. And that sound, it would stay with him for the rest of his life. Because what he met behind the smokehouse was not just a wounded girl. It was a creature the world had forgotten, and a truth even he wasn't ready to face. She didn't speak. Didn't whimper, didn't even blink. She crouched behind the smokehouse like a mountain lion caught between instinct and uncertainty. Body-coiled fingers splayed in the dirt, eyes locked onto Thaddeus Carmichael like he was the first human she'd seen in years. Or maybe ever. There was no recognition in her face. No language. No help me. Just teeth, breath, and rage disguised as fear. Thaddeus had trained wild mustangs in his younger days. He'd seen the whites of their eyes when the rope first touched their necks, that split second between panic and defiance. That's what he saw now. Not a girl, not a victim, a creature. a survivor. And yet, as she shifted her weight, clutching a wounded arm, something human did flicker. Not in her posture, not in her torn hide clothes, but in her pain. The kind of pain you don't scream about, the kind you've learned to carry in silence. So Thaddeus did the one thing that made no sense at all. He reached into his vest and pulled out a piece of dried jerky. Not a weapon, not a rope, just an offering. And in that moment, for just a breath, the growling stopped. We often talk about fight or flight gets a switch. But this girl lived there, permanently. She wasn't just reacting like an animal. She had become one to survive. Her clothes weren't stitched, they were torn hides. Her hair knotted with pine needles and dried blood. Her fingers thick claw-like from digging with bare hands. And yet her eyes, they searched his face. Not for kindness, for traps, for lies, for anything that would tell her this man was like the others who had chased her into the trees. It's not unlike how trauma shapes people in our own world. A child raised in abuse doesn't always cry for help. They flinch, they hide, they snarl at kindness, because kindness is often a setup for pain. Sometimes the most heartbreaking thing isn't a scream, it's silence. Or a growl from someone who's forgotten how to speak softly. Not every broken person needs fixing. Some just need space, and food, and time. To remember they were human once. What Thaddeus offered that morning wasn't charity. It wasn't rescue. It was something deeper. I see you, I won't chase you. I'll wait. And that sometimes is the first key to unlocking a locked soul. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She just crawled forward, took the food, and retreated again like a ghost, unsure if it could trust the living. But as she ate, Thaddeus noticed something he couldn't unsee. The scars, the hardened hands, the quiet glance she gave him between bites. She was watching him back. And that's when the first whisper of recognition crept into the morning stillness. Not from her, from him. What if she's not just wild? What if she was made this way? By men? He sat down in the dirt cross-legged, setting his rifle aside. Not to tame her, not to test her, but to say, I'm not leaving. She didn't take the second piece right away. It sat there in the dirt between them, dried seasoned beef barely 4 inches long, and yet it felt like a treaty, a line drawn in silence. Thaddeus Carmichael didn't move, didn't speak. He simply held out another piece, this time in his hand, and waited. She was still crouched, bones taut under weathered skin, like a creature deciding if the hand that fed might also strike. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, her good hand curled like a claw ready to bolt or bite. But her eyes, they flickered. Hunger is a language older than fear. It speaks in stomach growls. It drowns out logic. And sometimes when life has given you nothing but pain, it becomes the only reason to trust again. After long minutes, she crept forward on all fours, slow and silent as mist. She didn't look at the jerky. She looked at him. This wasn't about food. This was about risk. Taking something from a stranger, that's how pain had started before. A touch, a smile, a lie. So when her fingers brushed the edge of his even just barely, it was more than contact. It was a beginning. Sometimes words get in the way. We say too much. We apologize too loudly. We offer explanations before we offer listening. But survival strips all that away. In moments like this, with blood drying on her skin and silence thick as pine bark, gesture becomes language. The jerky was more than meat. It was a symbol. I won't chase. I won't hurt. Take what you need. She understood that. Not because she spoke English, but because she had lived too long without anyone offering anything without a price. Sometimes words get in the way. We say too much. We apologize too loudly. We offer explanations before we offer listening. But survival strips all that away. In moments like this, with blood drying on her skin and silence thick as pine bark, gesture becomes language. The jerky was more than meat. It was a symbol. I won't chase. I won't hurt. Take what you need. She understood that. Not because she spoke English, but because she'd lived too long without anyone offering anything without a price. Think of shelter animals, How many flinch when you raise a hand even to pet them? It's not the action they fear, it's the memory behind the movement. People are the same, especially those who've been through trauma. They don't need your perfect words, they need your quiet consistency. Show up, offer something small, do it again and again. One day, they might take it. One day, they might look up and see a person, not a threat. Trust isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through small offerings left without expectation. That morning in the dirt beside an old smokehouse, a dried strip of beef said more than any sermon ever could. I'll sit here, I'll wait. I'm not like the others. And that kind of patience, that's what teaches wild things how to breathe again. She finished the jerky slowly, her eyes never leaving his. No smile, no nod, but no growl either. That was enough. Then she did something Thaddeus didn't expect. She sat down. Not in fear, not in readiness, just to sit. As if just maybe this patch of earth was no longer enemy territory. And right there beneath the golden hush of dawn, something unspoken passed between them. A flicker of mutual recognition. Not all who growl are animals, not all who offer food are kind, but just sometimes two broken things recognize each other in the silence. That silence was broken by a sound that made Thaddeus's stomach twist, hoofbeats. Distant but growing louder. Not one rider, many, and from the way she stiffened, he knew. She recognized them. The sound came before the dust, before the shouting, before the guns were even visible. Hoofbeats. Thaddeus Carmichael had lived long enough in the Colorado backcountry to know the difference between a traveler and a posse. And this was no neighborly visit. 3 horses crested the rise beyond his barn. 3 riders, Caleb and Marcus Brennan brothers, by blood wolves by nature, and their cousin Owen, mean-eyed and twitchy. They rode hard and tight eyes, scanning the tree line, hands too close to their weapons. The kind of men who bring answers before asking questions. Kestrel froze. Not out of fear, out of instinct. She crouched low, her muscles tight, her body pressed into the earth like it might swallow her whole. But it didn't. And the riders kept coming. Leb Brennan smiled like a man who'd never meant it. "Morning, Carmichael," he said, his voice all sugar and poison. "Heard you might be harboring something that don't belong to you." Thaddeus kept his rifle low, but ready. He knew this game. He had played it in younger years under different flags and deadlier banners. But there was something colder about men like the Brennans. They weren't here to talk. They were here to confirm, to claim. And they brought with them the one thing more dangerous than firepower rumor. In small towns, fear travels fast, faster than logic, faster than truth. All it takes is one whispered tale at the general store. Pete saw wolf tracks bigger than usual. Mrs. Henderson's chickens are missing again. The Clearwater boy swears he heard something howl. And suddenly, there's a monster in the woods. And suddenly $50 hangs on its head. What started as curiosity becomes bounty. And what started as a girl surviving alone becomes a hunt. The Brennans didn't care about the truth. They cared about a payday and power. Think of the Salem witch trials, the internment camps, the way fear makes a town turn on its own. Sometimes it's not a monster that people see, it's a mirror. And they lash out because it's easier to destroy what you don't understand than to sit with the discomfort of understanding. The Brennans rode in that morning with that exact brand of certainty, and they were ready to spill blood for it. Just because someone comes wearing a badge or a neighbor's face doesn't mean they bring peace. Sometimes violence wears a smile. Sometimes it rides a familiar trail and calls you by name. And if you're not ready to recognize it, it might take more than just your land. It might take your soul. When Caleb dismounted and made for the barn, the very place Kestrel was hiding, Thaddeus stepped forward. His rifle raised, his voice firm. "You're not searching anything. This is my land." But even as he said it, he heard the old wood creak in the loft above. She was trapped. And the Brennans had come to draw blood. What happened next would decide whether Thaddeus would stand as a man who guarded what was his, or fall as a man who let fear win. There are mornings when the sun rises gentle and golden over the Colorado hills, when the air smells like pine and hope. And then there are mornings like this. The kind where blood spills before breakfast and choices carve themselves into a man's bones. Thaddeus Carmichael had never been afraid of wolves. He respected them, creatures of instinct and survival. But that morning, the only wolves on his land rode horses and wore boots. And they came with guns, rope, and bad intentions. Caleb Brennan was reaching for the barn door. Marcus was swinging that rope like he already knew who he'd bind. Owen flanked wide hand, twitching over his pistol. "You're hiding something, Carmichael. Something that don't belong." Thaddeus didn't move, didn't blink, just stared down the barrel of a decision no decent man should have to make. One shot. That's all he'd get. And behind him, Kestrel crouched in the loft, watching, calculating. A girl who wasn't raised by wolves, but survived like one. The creak of the floor above him gave her away. And Caleb's smile widened. "Well now," he said. "Looks like we won't need to search long after all." Thaddeus lifted his rifle, heart-pounding hands steady. "Get off my land," he said. "This is your only warning." But the Brennans never took kindly to warnings. The shot rang out first from Owen, a warning into the air, but it shattered the tension like glass. In that instant, it happened. Kestrel, barefoot, blood-stained, and blazing with fury, exploded out of the barn loft window. She didn't climb. She fell 20 feet through wood and glass, landing like she'd done it 100 times. Marcus turned, rope raised. But she was already on him, teeth bared, eyes wild, hands clawed. She wasn't running, she was attacking, and she was beautiful in her rage. You read stories about mothers lifting cars to save their babies, of veterans surviving ambushes by sheer instinct. What they all have in common, that moment when training ends and instinct begins. That's what happened here. Kestrel wasn't trained to fight, but the forest had taught her how to survive. And in that moment, it all came out. Every scar, every howl, every memory of running to live. She fought like an avalanche in human form. There comes a time in every life when silence is no longer noble, when you raise your voice or you become complicit. Thaddeus had spent 2 years in silence, mourning, watching, waiting. But that morning he fired his first shot, not to kill, but to protect. To stand between a wild girl and men who'd already decided she didn't deserve mercy. And in doing so, he remembered who he was before the grief. A man, a protector, a voice worth listening to. Caleb took a bullet to the shoulder and fell. Marcus's arm was mangled by Kestrel's bite. Owen dropped his gun and ran. But the worst wasn't over. Because before the dust even settled, Thaddeus knew. They'll come back. Not just for her, but for him now too. Because a man who sides with a wild girl over his own kind, he becomes an outsider. A threat, a story worth spreading. And stories in towns like Cedar Ridge, they don't fade, they fester. Kestrel stood, blood on her hands, her breath ragged. She looked at Thaddeus and didn't run. Not this time. Instead, she said the one thing he never expected, Kestrel. Her name. Given freely. A bridge between two broken worlds. But as they washed blood from their hands at the pump, another sound rose over the hills. More riders, and this time they weren't bounty hunters. They were men with law badges and louder voices. And the next choice Thaddeus made would test everything he thought he believed. Names carry weight. They're more than syllables or signatures. They're stories stitched into sound. They're the first thing we're given, and sometimes the first thing stolen. So when the girl finally said hers just one word, breathless and bruised Kestrel, it didn't just stop Thaddeus in his tracks. It gave her back to herself. Up until that point, she'd been many things. The feral thing behind the smokehouse. The half-savage they whispered about in town. The ghost of someone's mistake or someone else's sin. But now, she had a name. Kestrel, a bird that rides the wind. A creature born to hunt, but not hate. Not tame, but not broken either. She didn't offer more than that. No last name, no story, but it was enough. And in the silence that followed, Thaddeus said the name back softly, respectfully. Kestrel. Not like a command, not like a claim, but like a promise. It's not just in old westerns. All around us today, there are people whose names are buried beneath assumptions, refugees called migrant, survivors labeled case number, people written off as troublemakers, lost causes, or just plain nobody. But when someone listens long enough for a name, when they look past the fear, the silence, the growl in a voice, they give more than recognition. They offer restoration. In towns like Cedar Ridge, names could get you judged. But out there on that quiet stretch of land, with the blood still fresh and the morning wind curling through the trees, Thaddeus understood something simple but profound. If you're brave enough to offer your name, I damn well better be brave enough to respect it. And with that name, something shifted between them. The air wasn't so thick with suspicion anymore. Kestrel was no longer just a mystery to fear or a mouth to feed. She was a person, a fighter, a survivor with a past worth hearing when she was ready to tell it. But names are dangerous things in a town full of secrets. Because the moment Thaddeus said it aloud in front of the wrong ears, the whispers began to stir. And when the sheriff came knocking at sundown, he wasn't just asking questions. He was bringing a posse. Word is you're harboring a wild girl out here, one with a bounty on her head. The wind picked up. Kestrel's eyes narrowed. And Thaddeus knew tomorrow the fight wouldn't be just for survival anymore. It would be for truth. It started as a lie, a desperate, impulsive move. Thaddeus stood between Kestrel and a line of armed marshals, his heart pounding loud enough to drown out the wind. "She's my wife," he said. 3 words, sharp, final. A declaration forged not from love, but from loyalty. From a man who'd run out of other options. And just like that, everything changed. You see, the law out west didn't care much for nuance. It liked categories, clean ones, outlaw or citizen, wife or wild thing, legal or hunted. And in that moment, calling her wife was the only thing Thaddeus could think of that might stop the bullets from flying. It worked. Barely. The sheriff hesitated. The mayor shifted in his saddle. Even the marshals blinked, unsure how to proceed. Because a married woman, that was someone's responsibility, someone's protectorate, not just a bounty. All around the world, even now, people bend rules to protect the vulnerable. LGBTQ+ couples forced to marry for visa safety. Refugees claiming family status to avoid separation. Survivors of violence pretending connections just to stay safe. And while some call it deceit, others call it survival. Sometimes the lie is the only bridge to safety. Thaddeus hadn't planned to say it, but once the words left his mouth, he realized something deeper. It felt true, maybe not in the legal sense, but in the way Kestrel had slowly started to fill the empty spaces Margaret left behind. In the way she trusted him, not fully, but more than she'd trusted anyone else. And in the way his heart had started to beat again, not just for her, but because of her. A lie, sure, but maybe the kind of lie that grows roots. Later, when the men had gone, some angry, some uneasy Kestrel had turned to him, her eyes searching, her lips unsure. "Husband," she said quietly, testing the word, holding it in her mouth like a river stone. And he didn't laugh, didn't correct her. He just nodded, because the bond was already there. Strange, silent, strong. But lies, even the well-meant kind, have a way of catching up with you. And as word spread through Cedar Ridge and the marshals rode back to town with anger in their hearts, one truth became clear. Kestrel's freedom had bought them time, not safety, because soon men would return, not just with guns, but with questions. And when they came, she'd need to be ready, not just to survive, but to stand. It didn't take long. The dust hadn't settled from the last visit before fresh hoofbeats thundered through the valley again. This time, they weren't just rough boys with ropes and rumors. They were men of the law, federal marshals carrying paper pistols and assumptions. They weren't coming to ask. They were coming to take. Marshal Hayes was the kind of man the frontier respected, straight-backed, cold-eyed, and bound by the ink on a warrant more than the truth behind it. In his saddlebag, a signed order to seize a dangerous fugitive accused of assaulting a mail carrier. But Marcus Brennan was no mailman. He was a liar, and his lie had summoned men with legal authority and itchy fingers. And standing between them and Kestrel was Thaddeus, still the newly declared husband, still bluffing with borrowed courage. Here's the hard truth of frontier justice. Sometimes it wasn't about what really happened. It was about who spoke first, who looked more civilized, whose shirt had the least blood on it. Kestrel, no matter how she stood, no matter how she tried, would never pass those tests in the eyes of men like the mayor. Because law, especially in small towns, could be shaped by fear. Not truth, not fairness, just fear. And fear, when left unchecked, becomes cruelty with a badge. Even today, people who don't fit a mold often face the harshest judgment. Refugees mistaken for criminals. Neurodivergent teens labeled as threats. Women who don't speak the right way called unstable. Fear doesn't ask for facts. It assumes. It punishes. And that's why Thaddeus had to do more than just hide her. He had to help the town see her. If you let fear steer the reins, you'll burn the whole trail just to stop a shadow. But if you pause, listen, and look again, you might realize the danger isn't danger at all. Just someone who never had a place at your table. So Thaddeus stepped forward. Again, with the same quiet strength he once used to gentle wild horses. She's not a killer. She's not a threat. She's just been forgotten by the world. And maybe, just maybe, the world owes her more than fear. Some townsfolk began to shift in their saddles. One deputy lowered his rifle. Even Marshal Hayes hesitated, because truth, when spoken without anger, has a way of cutting deeper than bullets. But truth alone wouldn't be enough. Not here, not yet. Because the marshals weren't the only ones watching. The town still whispered. The council still debated. And Kestrel still hadn't learned how to show them she was more than the wild. Which meant the next step had to come from her. Could a woman who had only known survival learn to walk through a door as someone seen, not feared? They called her wild. They always had. Even when she stood still. Even when she said nothing. Even when her only crime was not smiling the way they liked. But wild wasn't the word for Kestrel, not really. She wasn't born a danger. She was made into a warning. In the Old West, the word wild was a weapon. They used it for anyone who didn't fit: the woman who rode alone, the child who didn't speak, the man who cried too often. Wild was how they justified leaving you behind. Or locking you up. Or worse, never trying to understand you at all. He watched her one morning crouched near the creek bed. She wasn't hunting. She was helping a baby jackrabbit, its leg caught in a rusted trap some hunter had left behind. She worked patiently, hands soft, despite all they'd survived. And when the rabbit hopped away, she smiled. A real smile. Not for him, not for the town, just for herself. Thaddeus realized then Kestrel wasn't wild. She was healing. And healing takes time. Even today, we still do it. A teenager with trauma gets labeled rebellious. A woman with boundaries gets called cold. A man with PTSD is written off as dangerous. But most people don't need correction. They need compassion. And most wounds don't need shame. They need space. You don't tame people like Kestrel with fences, rules, or stares. You let them come close when they choose to. You wait. You feed. You care. And then one day, they stop running. Not because they're trapped, but because they've finally found a home. Not all at once, but in small moments. She'd sit beside Thaddeus at sunset instead of behind the barn. She'd hum while tending the chickens. She even went into town once, just to see the mercantile, her fingers brushing bolts of fabric like they were too fine to touch. The people stared, but this time, some nodded, some smiled. A child waved, and Kestrel, quiet, cautious. Kestrel waved back. Healing had begun, but one thing still remained. If the world was ready to see her as more than wild, was she ready to believe she was more than a survivor? Some nights the past doesn't knock. It howls. Long after the fences are fixed, long after the wounds have scabbed over, long after the town starts saying maybe she's not so bad, the memories still come, and they come like wolves. Thaddeus would lie awake sometimes hearing it. The wind brushing the roof like fingers searching for cracks. The coyotes howling in the canyon like they remembered things humans wanted to forget. One night, he found Kestrel standing outside barefoot in the frost. She was looking at the hills, eyes distant, not afraid, not angry, just listening. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, didn't say a word. And together, they listened to the wind. There's this myth that healing means forgetting, that if you're still haunted, you're still broken. But that's not true. Some things stay. Not to torment you, but to remind you what you overcame. Kestrel didn't stop remembering the pain. She just stopped running from it. And that made all the difference. You don't wait until the past is silent to build a future. You build despite the echoes. You plant seeds even if the wind still bites. And sometimes that's how you reclaim the land inside you. One moment of courage, one night of stillness. The townsfolk still tell stories of Kestrel. Some say she was part spirit. Some say she vanished into the forest one spring and never came back. But Thaddeus knows better. She didn't vanish. She chose. To stay. To live. To love. And every now and then, when the wind is just right, it still carries her through the cottonwoods, soft, strong, and unmistakably human. In a world so quick to label, so quick to fear what it doesn't understand, let this be a reminder. The fiercest hearts are often the gentlest, and sometimes the wildest souls just need a little quiet, a little time, and someone who believes in them. So next time the wind howls, don't cover your ears. Listen, you might just hear someone finding their way home.